Restoration, the coexistence of art and science. A work of art which affects us in a complex manner through its artistic and ideological strength as a perfectly enclosed, unchanging and complete treasure. We don't fully realize that it was created by the hand of a master, a man living many centuries ago, and that its material basis consists of materials that were commonly known to his contemporaries. Most of them have actually been available in nature from time immemorial. The work was created from these materials according to contemporaneous recipes and the stylistic canon. The onlooker usually knows nothing of how a work came into being, or of the degrading of its material structure in the course of time, beginning latently on the day of its creation. One day it would in the end cause its destruction and gradual extinction if it were not for the assistance of the restorer. What makes a work of art unique, then, is the personal artistic creative expression, the author's artistic and ideological concept, the spiritual charge. Its material structure is merely the recording matrix of the individual creative process. What is at the beginning only the substance of the colors becomes, during the creative process, through the complicated technique of painting, remolded into the original spiritual statement of the artist, the work of art. This is also the awareness with which one must approach the restoration of a work of art. It is therefore possible to protect the originality of the work to its full extent only on the basis of the artistic abilities and professional knowledge of the restorer, enabling the full comprehension of the relationship between the artistic and the material basis of the work. Art and science are to be found here in rare coexistence, calling for training in both spheres. The future restorer requires this education during a 6-year master's course of study of the restoration of works of art at the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague. Here, the artistically gifted student must first master the art of painting using classical historical techniques. In the restorer's studio, he then acquires not only all the necessary specialized theoretical knowledge and practical skills, but also professional discipline and ethical principles. Dominant among the latter is humility in the face of the work of another artist and personal responsibility for the work of art entrusted to him. The technique and technology of restoration and the skills of conservation are the basic prerequisite for a part of the study of the restoration of works of art. Let's now give you at least a rough idea of how complicated the work of a restorer is, how fragile and sensitive the structure of a work of art, and what methods are used for its investigation and for the study of its material construction and the painting techniques used. For demonstration, we shall use the most complicated painting problem, i.e. a picture. The method of intervention and the artistic demands relate also, with slight differences, to wall paintings, polychrome statues and other works of art. For better orientation, especially of the viewing public, let's ask ourselves a few questions. What, who, with whom, how? What do we understand by the restoration of works of art? The restoration of works of art is an exact and specialized artistic discipline. Its mission is to keep the works of art of the cultural heritage alive. Every work of art is a unique organism, and as such it also requires an individual approach. The restorer's intervention must be based on a perfect understanding both of the artistic construction of the work and of the actual painting technique and the technical side, the technological structure. If it really came about that a work of art were to be merely preserved, or if an untaught conservator without artistic and specialist training were to have access to it, then we put the work at risk in its artistic quality, in its authenticity, and actually in the complexity of the completeness of the author's expression. It may be said that such a repair would basically cause at best what might be described as a lobotomy of the work, which means that it would weaken both its artistic effect and its spiritual charge. At worst, it might even mean that we would have to bid farewell to the work concerned. There are countless such cases at the present time. Who is a restorer? Everyone will certainly be able to formulate the answer for himself if we state what is involved in the work of a restorer. For reasons which have already been mentioned here, the vocation of a restorer of works of art necessarily also requires artistic ability. In addition to this, the quality of his performance is in direct proportion to the artistic sensibility and the art training of the restorer in the field of classical painting, including the study of historical painting techniques. A matter of course is the capacity for exact rational professional work, analogous to that of a surgeon. The artistic ability of the restorer is implemented in the control of every phase of his work, from the research and deciphering of the painting technique, through the removal of varnishes and overpainting, to the integration of the work by means of restrained retouching. It is the reintegration of the damaged part with the minimum of essential interventions which are not carried out to the detriment of the original and do not deprive it of its traces of age, which test the artistic ability and quality of the restorer. With whom does the restorer cooperate? With natural scientists and chemists. In the laboratory investigation of microscopic cross-sections, the restorer cooperates with the above-mentioned scientists on closer definition of the knowledge of materials used. Restorers have been using scientific research methods for 70 years, and it was they who invited the natural scientists and chemists to help with their work. As applied research, it also involves the search for new methods. These can then help to achieve greater precision in dating, definition of the circle of authors or the locality in which the work originated. Apart from natural scientists, the restorer also cooperates with art historians. The restorer cooperates with art historians in the study of art historical connections, life and institutions, archive documents, and historical recipe books. Determination of authorship, classification of works, and care for collections should all be fully mastered by the art historian. Our system of restoration work with the 6 years of master's professional and artistic training of the restorer has been tried and tested by over half a century on the tradition of the so-called Czech School of Restoration, applied since its establishment in 1947 by Professor Bohuslav Slánský. Today, this system is used by the majority of university-level schools of restoration in Europe. In the basic concepts, we have now reached the last question: how does the restorer work? The restorer says, first of all, I must decipher the author's intention and the artistic means by which he created it, so that I can return the work to the eyes of the onlooker in its authentic form. For easier understanding of the complexity of the structure of work and the methods of investigating it before restoration, from which emerges the basis for the study of historical art techniques, we shall demonstrate the individual method of some of the works being restored at present by the students of the School of Restoration at the Academy. How then does the restorer work? He studies all his life. Yes, that's the main leitmotif of the restorer's work. To preserve his high degree of expertise, the restorer must know both the present state of knowledge in the field, the restoration of important works, and the research on them, and also, above all, historical art techniques. Study is beneficial first and foremost for one's own restoration process, within which one can also gain the most information during the restorer's investigation. Study, however, also brings some further hidden knowledge of the process of the birth of the work. This then gives a glimpse of the creative process of the author and his mental processes in the course of the work. The handwriting of his painting provides information about his character, his mental mood. It also testifies to his talent, the certainty or hesitation in seeking the most suitable expression of the chosen theme and idea by means of the composition of the shape and color harmonies in the area of the painting. The selection of the best procedure for the restorer's treatment of the work. Everything begins with the visual investigation, methods of restoration investigation, study of historical sources in collaboration with art historians, detailed observation, description and photographic documentation of the state of the work before restoration, investigation on a macro scale, investigation under ultraviolet light, investigation in the infrared part of the spectrum, infrared reflectography, investigation by means of X-ray. Study of historical sources in collaboration with art historians. After accepting the work for restoration, there follows the study of historical sources, archive documents, and the genealogy of the work. This should be the domain of the art historians, or is usually at least carried out with their assistance. Detailed observation, description and photographic documentation of the state of the work before restoration. The initial step is investigation in intensive, visible, dispersed and strong light on an ordinary scale. This provides the restorer with the first and fundamental information on the state of the paint layers, the ground and the base. It is of fundamental importance to capture the state of the work and its characteristic damage by means of high-quality scientific photography. Also important is the time spent in observing the work, when the restorer really gets close to the work and penetrates its artistic rules. Investigation on a macro scale. Through observation in detail and on a macro scale, the restorer requires plenty of information. He investigates, for instance, the technique of the painting, its composition and the author's handwriting, the strokes of the brush, the characteristics of age and the traces of time. But mainly he acquires information about the defects which have occurred in the structure of the picture. According to the evaluation of fine cracks in the paint and in the ground layer, and according to the deformation of the paint layer, he acquires information about the state and the cohesion of the layers of the painting and the ground. Investigation in ultraviolet light. The luminescence of the surface of the painting caused by ultraviolet lighting captured in photographs and photographs with direct ultraviolet rays in the area of 360 nanometers provide a testimony on the layering of the author's glazes and varnishes, but mainly about later secondary interventions, about layers of overpainting, retouching and varnishes from various periods. The differentiation of the time sequence is made possible by the varying intensity of the luminescence and its typical coloring. Investigation in the infrared part of the spectrum. Infrared rays make it possible to look into the invisible lower layers of the painting, to uncover, for example, the author's initial sketch, and thus consider the difference between the expression of the author's drawn handwriting in the spontaneous moment of the process of creation and the visible definitive art form of the work, which is always due to a certain extent to the artistic canon of the period. It also makes it possible to show some of the old retouching and overpainting. Infrared reflectography. Infrared reflexography represents further progress in the investigation. The students of the Academy now have at their disposal an infrared motion camera with a Vidicon electron tube. The live picture from the camera is, compared with photographs, more mobile and makes the finding of a shot easier because it can be observed directly on the screen of the computer. Here it is possible to save a picture taken of a suitable part to the computer memory and print it out at any time. If we compare a real photograph with a photograph taken by means of infrared reflexography, then we can ascertain the parts which we could not see in the normal spectrum. Investigation by means of X-ray. X-ray technology gives the restorer a special view of the invisible construction of the work, into the author's handwriting, but also into the history of the work. The graduated modeling with lead white and Baroque paintings with a covering tone of the underpainting and also filled and retouched defects or completely repainted pictures are uncovered by the X-rays, shaded in varying intensity according to the permeability of the color layer. The shots which you can see help to identify a painting from the depository of the Picture Gallery of Prague Castle as a work by Jacopo Tintoretto. Note the changes in the position of the head of the Madonna, altered by the master himself in order to achieve a better composition. Another example shows that the portrait of a cardinal from the collection of the Knights of the Cross with Red Star was painted on an older picture of a Madonna. The picture was identified during research and mapped out with X-ray photographs of the entire surface. Methods of restoration research, diagnosis of faults, taking of microscopic samples. On the basis of evaluation of the findings of the visual investigation by optical methods, the restorer forms an initial diagnosis of the defects and their expected causes. He verifies this by means of probes. First of all, he carries out tests for the solubility in the binding agents of the ground and the individual layers of painting. Then he starts the verification of the stratigraphy and solubility of the varnishes and other paintings by means of small probes. If circumstances require it, then immediately after the visual investigation, the restorer further defines the situation by taking a few samples for microscopic cross-sections of the paint layers. We are now in the presbytery of the Church of St. Anne in the old town of Prague, in one of the most important ancient monuments in Prague, dating from the Middle Ages, which was actually reconstructed in many phases of construction. We are now about to take samples from a wall painting which was quite recently discovered by the School of Restorers in the Church of St. Anne. These samples will be used after being embedded and after the polishing of the cross-sections for the evaluation of the actual composition of the color layers under a microscope. These investigations will also be carried out in our laboratory in the Academy of Fine Arts. Under the microscope on polished cross-sections of the micro-samples taken, the restorer then studies the painting technique and the stratigraphy. Visual evaluation is made of the layering of the painting, the pigments used, their granularity and approximate age, lake interlayers, overpainting, the thickness and composition of the ground, the type of base and so on. The restorer, who is carrying out the investigation of the work, evaluates the laboratory results in the context of all the knowledge of the work and integrates all the information from the restoration investigation and research. Only he can responsibly decide on the need for and justification of the taking of further samples and ask the chemists questions aimed at the further clarification of the necessary facts. And this now brings us to the use of laboratory methods. Let's mention at least some of them. Orientational stipulation of pigments, histochemical analysis, precise proof of pigments. From the studio, the samples go to the laboratory where the identification of the individual layers of painting continues. The standard procedure at the beginning is the taking of photographs in the microscope in daylight and in ultraviolet light. Then the pictures are compared here, and from the differences there are determined some parts of the painting which were not evident at first sight. These are in particular picture varnishes which shine beautiful in ultraviolet light but in daylight are not visible at all. Then comes the description of the individual layers which are numbered, after which the chemist and the restorer have a discussion about what else is necessary to discover. Further methods are selected in accordance with the requirements of the restorer. The photographs from the microscopes are all taken with a digital camera. We introduced this system of documentation completely in digital form in 1997, thanks to a grant from the Ministry of Education for research into historical art techniques. The determining of organic components is considerably more complicated. For instance, proteins are determined microscopically by what is known as histochemical analysis. This method determines the presence of proteins such as glue or eggs, but it doesn't determine which. For this, use must be again made of another method, in particular chromatographic infrared spectral analyses, and these have mainly been carried out in cooperation with the Science Faculty and Institutes of Charles University in Prague. For the precise specification of inorganic pigments or of inorganic components in general in a sample, we mainly use a combination of the methods of optical and electron microscopy. From the principle of electron microscopy, it emerges that the electrons which are reflected from the surface of the sample emphasize, if we eliminate the voltaic effect, the so-called chemical contrast. This means that the heavier substances are depicted as lighter in color and the lighter substances, on the contrary, are shown as being darker. In this way, it is possible to distinguish from one another substances which have the same color under the optical microscope. These substances differ, on the other hand, very significantly in their atomic weight, for example, lead white and zinc white. We utilize this in particular in the detection of fragmentary or very thin little layers, because here we are working with large magnifications. In addition to this, on the impact of the electron, X-ray radiation is also released and is further analyzed in the spectrometer, providing us with the precise elemental composition of an individual grain or an individual layer. This method safely suffices in the majority of cases for the identification of the pigment, and it is in addition non-destructive. The sample is not damaged in any way, and it is possible to store it in the archives. If we wish to make a further distinction between substances which have the same chemical composition, then we normally use some supplementary method for phase analysis, such as X-ray powder diffraction, where the substances are then identified on the basis of their crystalline structure. Let's liven up the dry theory again with some practical examples. For instance, this polychrome Gothic statue of the crucified Christ of Dolany was completely repainted several times, so that it completely changed his expression. Thanks to analysis, it was possible to support the assumption that the continuous Gothic layer had also been preserved under the Baroque layer. Canvas of the portrait of the lady from s.r.o. This was made up of 3 strips. The restorer's investigation ascertained that the stretching edges of the original middle part had been secondarily extended at the seams. Before the removal of the additions with overpainting, this fact was confirmed by comparison of the grounds on the micro cross-sections. Danger of disrupting the coexistence of art and science. Everything which has been heard so far about the professional restoring of works of art concerns the ideal situation, which is perhaps not always the case in contemporary practice. The carefully restored Gothic frescoes, which we see here in the Hněvkovice church, can also look quite different. We have chosen at random one repulsive example of restoration in the Gothic church in Patov. Amateur applications deleted the delicate profiling of the Gothic vaulting ribs and their endings. Description of the formerly uncovered painting and the method by which it was carried out do not give one much faith in the professional safeguarding of historical painting. Responsibility for the treatment of a work of art is always that of the restorer. However, the same responsibility must be borne by all participating professions, especially the authority for care of the cultural heritage. We find increasingly frequent vulgarization in the care of historical monuments, but also in the sphere of restoration. We often see so-called restored historical monuments shining with newness, which have lost the most important thing, the traces and the patina of time. This applies in particular where commercial interests or simply lack of education and taste have prevailed over elementary respect and humility. The result of the implementation of the technical viewpoint on a work of art can be seen on the compound statue of St. Vitus on Charles Bridge in Prague. The bearing of the surface by laser has literally skinned the lion cub and cruelly uncovered the individual repairs. At the portal of the Klamgalas Palace, on the other hand, heritage puritanism prevailed. The preservation even of the wounds of time. Even though the layman might not think so, these atlases have been restored. In the restoration of the Ungelt, there again prevailed the insensitive repainting of the chiaroscuro. We could continue this list for a long time. This, for example, is what the owner of the firm considers to be the restoration of an early Baroque portal. It's hard to believe that permission can have been given for something like this. The only solution is a functional law on the care of historical monuments and the truly professional activity of all those concerned. A good example of the coexistence of science and art might be the cooperation of a former director of the National Gallery, Dr. Vincent Kramář, with the restorer, Professor Bohuslav Slánský. The fruit of this cooperation are a number of restored Gothic and other works which form the basic fund of the collection of the National Gallery. The Restoration School of the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague maintains and develops this traditional coexistence of art and science so as to ensure that restored monuments will be preserved for future generations in as authentic a form as possible.
Umělecké dílo na nás působí svou výtvarnou a myšlenkovou silou komplexně, jako dokonale uzavřený, neměnný a dokončený klenot. Neuvědomujeme si plně, že vzniklo rukou mistra, člověka žijícího před mnoha staletími, a že jeho hmotnou podstatu tvoří materiály běžně známé jeho současníkům, většinou dokonce nalézané od nepaměti v přírodě. Z nich je dílo vytvořeno